So hear that go. And so welcome everybody. There are a couple more people coming in, but our very first talk this morning is exploring teachers' thoughts on applying post-method pedagogy in Chile. And we have Bruno Peralta Gonzalez. Bruno, you're from UMCE, right?
Yes, I am.
All right. So whenever you're ready.
All right. So first of all, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I recognize a few familiar faces that made me feel really happy to see those faces here. Anyway, today my talk is about exploring teachers' thoughts on applying post-methods pedagogy in Chile. So my two main words here are, teachers' thoughts and post-method pedagogy, which I will explain in due time. But from the meantime, in the meantime, teachers' thoughts refers to beliefs, which I will explain later too. Anyway, my table of contents today is going to be divided into, my whole presentation is going to be divided into 4 main points. My motivation to do this, my literature, which is narrowed down to post methods and specifically macro strategies and teachers' beliefs. Then I will talk about my research methods, like research stuff, and then my main conclusions and some comments, okay? And in terms of motivation, I believe that as teachers, we have a very important role in our society. And I think that Pennycook opinion summarizes this very well from 1989. He says that it becomes evident that the goals and therefore the procedures of language teaching closely reflect the social, political, cultural, and intellectual climate of the times. And all of us know that the political climate of our times now are very important. And from here, I can identify 2 main areas. One of them is that nowadays we're experiencing some sort of postmodern social view, and also our social political climate is very polarizing. We're experiencing marches and rallies from years. Now we voted for a new constitution. We're electing constituents for our new assembly. And I believe that those changes have to be reflected in our language teaching classrooms. But I start thinking to myself, what can I do from my perspective as a language teacher in my classroom? Apart from going on a strike with my colleagues, apart from attending rallies and marches with my students, is there anything I can do from my classroom in my day-to-day life? And trying to find solutions to this, or answers to these questions, I arrived at this, which is Kumaravadivelu's post-method condition, or his macro strategies. From the 90s, Dr. Kumar has been talking about post-methods, and I believe that they have how can I say this? The potential of being very important in our society, because they contain a very strong social-political nature. And this social-political nature mixed with language teaching, I believe might help our language teaching classroom, considering the political climate of our times. And for this, I'm going to narrow down my literature to these things, to macro strategies, post methods. But first, I feel like I need to talk about what methods are. So according to Bell, who in 2003 stated that methods could be a smorgasbord of ideas, like putting many ideas together, or a grab bag of classroom practices, which means you take all your classroom practices, you put them in a bag, and then you have your method, or perhaps a prescription for practice, which is guidelines that we can follow in order to do our lessons, or our methods or methodology. But Pennycook also in 1989, he talked about method being the result and the analysis of a linear development over time, basically saying we do something for a long time, we write it down, and that becomes a method. But this has many problems, in my opinion, the concept of method. In my opinion, this is very rigid, and Noonan, for example, describes a method and its guidelines as a proposition for a single set of precepts for teacher and students. And in this case, if supposedly we follow those guidelines, we will learn. But that is, in my opinion, very, very rigid. And in 1991 and today, this had very little evidence of method working like this. Basically, if we follow something, we're going to learn. But what happens with the many differences that we have in a classroom? And for this, we can use a Brown perspective. In 2002, he expressed that our profession has emerged into an era of understanding a vast number of language teaching contexts and purposes, and an even larger number of student needs, learning styles, and affective traits. So basically, we are facing a classroom that is very diverse. We are facing a classroom that is very different, and each one of our students is very, very different. So how can we assume that one method, and if we follow the guidelines of that one method, is going to help us to support all of our students, and all of them are different? So thinking about this, we arrive at post method. So what are post methods? This is a key concept of my presentation. And the main difference between post methods and methods is how they are conceived. A method is very rigid, but a post method tries to change the relationship that a method or a guideline or theory has with teachers. So this is a very, not entirely new, but it's a fairly recent standpoint for pedagogy. And this is not limited by absolute truth, like methods or modernism. This is not limited by traditional classroom roles or the roles that we know of the teacher and the students. And it is not limited by general context, because now in post methods, we understand that the context that we have in our lesson is a collective context created by the different cultures and the different contexts of each one of our students and the teacher. So when I say that post methods are not limited by absolute truth, we start rejecting this position of the teacher as the only person who has culture in the classroom. So Kumaravadivelu, this author who proposed post methods and macro strategies, he talks about refiguring the connection that there is between theory and practice. And in this regard, we are empowering teachers, because we are asking teachers, or we are allowing teachers to create theory from their practice and to inform their practice from the theory they create, instead of just following methods from other researchers and methods which were created in a different context, in a different country, with different students. Now teachers have a bit more power in their hands in terms of creating the theory, and I believe that's something that is absolutely necessary. I mean, if we looked, or if we listened to the statements of ex-minister Briones, like bringing teachers from abroad, or perhaps, the threats that the Minister Figueroa has made to teachers and schools, we need something that can empower teachers. And I believe that post methods can help us doing that. And of course, now after discussing post methods, we arrive at macro strategies. Macro strategies are conceived under the framework of post methods. And even though they are 10, for the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on just a few of them. I'm going to mention 5, but I'm focusing on 9 and 10. Just to give you an example, these macro strategies are guidelines that teachers can follow in order to create their own theory. One of them is contextualizing linguistic input. Basically, everything you teach in a classroom has to have context. I mean, teaching items in isolation, that's something that we shouldn't do. Macro strategy number 7 talks about integrating language skills, which is basically never separating writing and speaking and listening, but just teaching everything together and working with everything together. In this regard, we are imitating how language actually works in real life. When we promote learner autonomy in macro strategy number 8, we talk about making our students independent, making our students able to control perhaps their resources in order to learn the language in a better way. But for me, the most important ones are given in number 9, 10, which have this social political nature. One of them is raising cultural awareness, and the other one is ensuring social relevance. When we talk about raising cultural awareness, we're talking about understanding that the teacher is not the only cultural informant in the classroom, that every single member of our lesson is as important in terms of culture as the next one. And that is something that we must understand now as teachers if you want to build different theories from our practice. And last but not least, we have macro strategy number 10, which is ensuring social relevance. And in this case, we talk about every class we make or every content that we decide to work with our students has to be socially relevant for them. And in this regard, we cannot ignore the social uprising, we cannot ignore the pandemic, and we cannot ignore the fact that now we're having these meetings online. So those things are concepts that we have to bring into the classroom. And many teachers are doing that, and all of us are doing that, but that's because it was our decision. But what happens if we could create theory from that? I'm pretty sure that all of us have experience working with textbooks in which we have to, I don't know, ask our students, when was the last time that you traveled by plane? And not everyone travels by plane. I mean, some of our students didn't even have breakfast at the time I was asking that question when I was, following the textbook. So we need to ensure that our lessons are socially relevant for the students and for our new context. Considering all this, for me, these are great ideas. But what happens if teachers do not believe in those ideas? What happens if teachers disagree with those ideas? Then what can I do? In this regard, I also wanted to explore teachers' beliefs, meaning that I wanted to ask teachers about their thoughts on applying these macro strategies. And here we have the opinion of Borg, which is, in my opinion, very important to understand this. He says that it is widely recognized that education is more likely to impact on what teachers do if it also impacts on their beliefs. So basically, if you want to do something, different, you need to believe in it, and that for me is key. Now, based on this, I had these 3 sub-research questions. Basically, I wanted to ask teachers, do you agree with the macro strategies? Do you see any benefit in applying them? I mean, are there any good? And last but not least, are they appropriate to your context? Meaning, perhaps you can agree with something, but that doesn't mean that you can apply it in your classrooms or in your context. For me, that was key. So in terms of research methods, I applied a questionnaire to 25 teachers. I gave them a macro strategy and I asked them, do you agree with it? Do you see any benefit? Can you apply it in your context? And from their answers from 1 to 10, the higher the number, the better the response, meaning that they agreed and they were applicable, they saw benefit in them. 25 teachers, answered the questionnaire, and I divided them following Huberman's cycle of the career cycle. And I divided my teachers in years of experience, 1 to 3 years, 4 to 6, and 7 to 18 years. And the results, in my opinion, were quite interesting because in terms of years of experience, the teachers, all of them very much agreed with the macro strategies. They thought it was a great idea. They saw a lot of benefit in applying the macro strategies, but the problem came, the problem, quotation marks, came with context suitability. Because even though they agreed and saw benefit, 9 out of 10, the context suitability or how applicable those macro strategies are in their context was significantly lower than the other ones. Even though 6.89 is a fairly high number, in my opinion, it is not as high as the other one. So we can also see a big difference in terms of years of experience. The more experienced teachers are, the more they agree with the macro strategies, the more benefits they see, and the more applicable they think they are in their context. Perhaps this is about the tools that we have as teachers. And even though I also asked this, there isn't a significant difference in terms of qualifications. Teachers with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, there weren't significant difference. Only 1 point here in context suitability. But then when I interviewed teachers and I asked them to go deeper with their answers, I found very interesting things about context suitability, or the things that were preventing teachers from applying macro strategies. In terms of integrating language skills, this teacher in particular, he said that he only had 45 minutes per lesson, and it was very difficult to mix every single language skill into one lesson, not only because of the time constraints, but also because of the evidence that he had to provide for the administration. So administration was asking him to provide evidence every one or two weeks. So it was impossible for this teacher in particular to provide evidence for a full project. And in terms of macro strategy number 9, which is raising cultural consciousness or awareness, this teacher very much agreed with the statement. They saw a lot of benefit in applying it, but the problem came when it comes to sharing about context. According to this teacher, some students felt ashamed when talking about their context or their culture because they came from very, very rough neighborhoods and they thought that they were going to be mocked by other students. And in this regard, it was very difficult for this teacher to do this, to share about cultural consciousness. And last but not least, in terms of ensuring social relevance, all these teachers worked with socially relevant topics. For example, the teacher here on the far left, he took pictures during rallies and marches and shared those pictures with students and asked them, how do you feel about this? So this material for him was very important. But the key point in here was that support from your administration is essential, is vital. Without support from your administration, you cannot do this. So this teacher in particular, he had, the help from administration, or at least the support. Also, the teacher here in the middle, he talked with students about, debating, giving opinion, contrasting ideas, and expressing ourselves in terms of the pandemic. And a key point for this teacher was what he said here at the end: we don't teach our students to be the next Chomskys. We teach because we want our students to live in community. So which, talks to us about the connection we have about theory and practice and academia and, things that we actually do in the classroom. And of course, the last teacher.
4 minutes. Last 4 minutes.
Thank you. And in this regard, the last teacher, the one in the far right, talked a little about health because it was something that was happening. And all these teachers, when they included socially relevant information in the lessons, they saw a lot of benefit. But of course, the main constraint here is about administration. Now, wrapping up my research in talking about the main conclusions, I know that applying macro strategies in state-funded schools is a challenge on its own. It's very difficult, but in order to apply them, when we talk about context suitability, we need to work with structural changes. And this is information I gathered from all the teachers I interviewed. And the things they listed are schools' objectives, teacher workload, students' previous experiences with other methodologies, meaning that sometimes students are used to working with traditional methodologies, and when they work with post methods or more communicative methodologies, they don't feel very comfortable working with them. We also talked about students' motivation in general, cultural aspects of our society. If we make other students feel ashamed of where they come from, how can we raise cultural awareness or consciousness? In our lessons, since because we've got many students, we also face mixed levels. We also have many number of students in the classroom, etc., etc., etc. So in order to finish, with this research, I learned many things, that teachers in our country are connected in the sense that all of us can create theory from our practice, because we're constantly trying things, we're constantly applying new methods and techniques. But what if we could just write this down, create theory, apply this, and not depend so much on theories that we learn at universities that sometimes are outdated? So I propose that nowadays and from now onwards, we should focus on start changing university programs, and instead of working with teachers and methodologies and things that they are going to change when they start working, perhaps we should start working with post methods and giving students the tools to create their own theory with the practice, so they can inform their own practice with the theory they create. And a perfect tool for this might be the implementation of exploratory action research, which gives students, or pre-service teachers and newly qualified teachers, the tools to start investigating on their own. I know that the road is very long for us, but I'm sure that from our role as teachers of English in our classroom, we can do a lot to start changing and reshaping our society. And finally, everything that's happening with our society has to be reflected in the classroom, following Pennycook's idea of our language classroom reflects the political climate, so it has to. And that's it. Well, thank you for listening. thank you for your time. And I believe now we have some questions or 10 minutes for questions.
We do have 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to go
Yeah.
ahead and stop the recording though. I think I am.
Bruno, thank you.